Hey guys, it's Miss Thurston, and I want to share with you the very first Constitution of the United States, the Articles of Confederation. So think about where we are in our history class. We have fought the Revolutionary War, and the United States is no longer a colony of Great Britain. We are free and we are an independent nation. We have signed the Treaty of Paris. It's 1783. And after 7 long years of war, we are ready to operate independently and no longer have a king or that dictator, what we felt was a dictatorship over us. We wanted to be independent and we're America, as we said in class all this time. Um, and but in order to talk about how our government was going to operate, we have to do a little bit of time travel, of going back in time, back before we even, back when we wrote our breakup letter to King George, or just after, to 1777, when we decided to send delegates to Philadelphia and say, hey, what is our government going to look like? How are we going to set up our United States of America, these independent states that are going to still act like one nation? So we sent delegates to the very first Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, and they came up with the Articles of Confederation, and that essentially established our first Constitution of our United States. And we're going to talk about, and so by the time that we get through this presentation, we're going to be able to describe the framework of the Articles of Confederation, and we're going to analyze the structure of the Articles of Confederation, because it led to one of our first almost Civil War like battles called Shays' Rebellion. So in your interactive notebook, I want you to set up your 2-column notes, and I want you to take some notes about the Articles of Confederation, and then you're also going to take some notes a little bit later on in the presentation about Shays' Rebellion, because Shays' Rebellion was a direct result of the weaknesses in the Articles of Confederation. And Shays' Rebellion had the potential to set off a string of events that threatened to end our newfound independence just as we got it started and up and running. So you'll see what I mean in just a few minutes. So if your ILN is up and ready to go with your 2-column notes, let's rock and roll and talk about the Articles of Confederation. So the Revolutionary War is over and we are an independent nation. What's our government going to look like? How are we going to run ourselves as a nation? What is our first constitution going to look like? Well, in order to answer that question, we go back in time to 1777 to the Articles of Confederation. And the Articles of Confederation are considered our first constitution. And we have this man to thank for that, I should say. His name was John Dickinson. And John Dickinson was the primary drafter of the Articles of Confederation. And Congress did not actually accept the Articles of Confederation until 1781. But I want you to think about everything that happened up until then. So we wrote our breakup letter in 1776, sent that over. The Constitutional Convention happened in 1777, the very first one. And then we had a little thing called the Battles of Lexington and Concord and the start of the Revolutionary War. So life was a little busy for the colonists during that time. So it's no wonder that the articles did not get accepted, or here's a vocabulary term for you, ratified until 1781, because not only did the delegates have to take it back to their leaders, um, they had also to contend with, getting their militias together, all those other kinds of things. So, under the Articles of Confederation, the government was structured very differently than the government that you see today. Where we have three branches of government: the judicial, which is our courts, the executive, which is our president, and the legislative, which is our Congress. The Articles of Confederation only had one branch of government, um, which was the legislative branch. And each state or each colony, which was now called a state, would have only one vote in the legislative branch, regardless of size. So little tiny Rhode Island would have the same number of votes as big old New York, who had a lot of people in it at the time. So we're going to talk about the problems that created. Congress was given the sole authority to govern the country, but that didn't mean a whole lot. Excuse me. Congress would establish temporary courts to hear dispute among the states. We're going to talk about what that means in just a second. And there was no court system or executive branch yet. In other words, there was no permanent court system, judicial branch, or executive branch, such as a president or a vice president. The creators of the articles believed that the government was essentially an agreement with the people, and that a power originated from the people. They further believed that the best form of government was a republic, in which the people's wishes were addressed by chosen representatives. The legislative body would be elected by and directly responsible to the people. Soon after independence had been declared, many smaller states expressed concern regarding the overlapping claims to Western lands made by many of the states with larger populations. The small states feared their voices would be drowned out if representation was based solely on population. Thus, to equalize representation in Congress, each state only had one vote, regardless of the size of its population. Congress was given the responsibility for governing the country. However, it wasn't given much power to do so. An executive committee was meant to oversee the operations of the government, but it ended up serving more like a cabinet of advisors than actual leadership. Congress had the authority to establish temporary courts to hear dispute among the states, but these courts could only act as mediators because they and the executive committee had no power to enforce any laws. So, what powers did the Articles of Confederation grant Congress? Well, Congress could declare war and make peace, because this was of immediate concern, considering the fact that they had already sent a breakup letter to Great Britain, and we were already in the midst of a war to try to get our independence from Great Britain. And they really wanted to make a treaty with these foreign nations, as well as gain support from any other foreign nation, most notably from France, Hence the reason why they sent Ben Franklin over to try to gain support from France in the war effort. They also granted Congress power to establish an army and the navy and print and borrow money, but they didn't give them much power to actually pay for it because they didn't tax the individual states. Congress could establish weights and measures and hear disputes among the states related to trade and boundaries. During and after the war, individual states sometimes established tariffs in order to raise revenue and discourage the sale of imports from foreign countries or neighboring states that competed with homegrown products. Other states targeted these tariffs. Other states usually targeted by these tariffs usually retaliated in kind. So think about it. If North Carolina targeted South Carolina with a tariff for their goods, then, in other words, charged a tax for anybody wanting to bring in North Carolina goods, South Carolina would then do the same. So that prevented anybody from importing goods from other states, making it very expensive for anybody to get goods from anybody else that was not made within your own state. This limited your buying power. So, what were the actual strengths of the Articles of Confederation? The Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, thus ending the American Revolution. Because Congress, under the Articles of Confederation, had the power to declare war and peace, that was their one major prop that they could claim victory to. The other thing that they could do, because they could settle boundary disputes, was establish the Northwest Ordinance. It is with the Northwest Ordinance, it established an orderly way for the United States to expand its borders. And it also established a process for people to apply for statehood. If 5,000 free males owned at least 50 acres of land and banded together, they could start a government of their own and then apply for statehood. If that area's population was over 60,000, it could then become a state. But here's also a key. The Northwest Ordinance prohibited slavery in these new territories. So what did that do? It limited slavery to only the southern states. The Northwest Territory was east of the Mississippi River and north of the Ohio River. The states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin would be formed from this area and by this ordinance. Several problems faced the new nation right away. In the years after the Treaty of Paris, the United States experienced a number of near crippling problems that made the task of governing more difficult. The leaders of the United States had virtually no international experience beyond the confines of the British Empire. They would have to establish diplomatic and economic relations with countries that had been in existence for hundreds of years. The new nation first had to establish trade relations with foreign nations under its own flag rather than that of the powerful British Empire. In addition, Britain would no longer treat the United States as its favorite child, and this demotion in status would make establishing trade relations with other countries even more difficult. The US also had to deal with financial troubles. During the war, America had racked up an impressive debt and both owed money both to foreign nations and to US citizens. The states of the new nation would soon prove to be united in name only. The colonies had always possessed a sense of separation from one another in times of peace and had competed often with one another for British favor and economic advantage. The only time the states had truly come together was during the Revolutionary War, and that had only occurred because it suited their needs. With most of the nation's power residing in the state legislatures, the nation under the Articles of Confederation had only a fragile unity at best. So the Articles of Confederation were weak on purpose. They had a strong initial desire for a weak central government because they feared one person having too much power. The states had greater power than the national government. And as a result, the national government had no power to tax people. The national government had no power to tax. And because the national government had no power to tax, it had no power to wage, even though the national government had power to wage war, it had no means to pay for it because it had no power to tax its own citizens. The national government had the power to issue money, but the states didn't have to use it, and each state could issue its own currency. So stop and think, how could this be a problem if each of the 13 individual states, now 18 states, thanks to 5 additional states with the Northwest Ordinance, if each state issued its own currency, how could this possibly be a problem? So here's some examples of some old-time currency. Say I'm a salesman going from state to state peddling my wares. Maybe I make horse bridles. And I travel up and down the East Coast selling horse bridles. I would have to exchange my currency in each and every single state that I went to. Could you see how this would be a problem? Look at the different denominations. $7, $3, $8, 5 shillings. What is even a shilling? There was no one currency making things very difficult. Does this sound like a United States to you? So in review, Congress had no power to raise taxes. Congress couldn't regulate foreign or state trade. Laws had to be approved by 9 out of 13 states. That was their idea of consensus. Consensus is the concept where everyone has to agree even if nobody is entirely happy. So can you imagine trying to get 9 out of 13 groups happy? Can you imagine anything getting done? Hardly anything got done. And since the national government could not tax and the national money was worthless, debt became a huge problem, not just for the national government, but soon it became a problem for the states as well. George Washington said, the states during this period from 1783 to 1787 were held together by a rope of sand. Other weaknesses of the articles weren't just affecting the government. It was affecting the people that the government was supposed to actually, govern. Think about the soldiers who had fought in the war. They were expecting to be paid. But because, again, the government isn't taxing anybody, the soldiers weren't getting paid. Most of the soldiers that had signed up were farmers. And because they weren't getting paid, they weren't able to pay their debts. What could this possibly lead to? And now, the rest of the story. After 8 years of war, the American Revolution was over, and General George Washington retired to a hero's welcome on Mount Vernon, Virginia. This was kind of like his second retirement, because remember, he was also a hero of the French and Indian War. Soldiers of the colonial army had been promised back pay as well as pensions for fighting in the war. Because remember, they had initially signed up for only years' contracts, and some ended up fighting for way longer than they had originally anticipated. So upon release from the army, there was no money to pay them for their service. Some soldiers went home with only 3 things: their uniforms and their musket, a month's pay, and worthless government certificates saying, thanks for a job well done. This brewed resentment and distrust, especially in the tiny state of Massachusetts. Representatives from the western part of the state weren't able to attend their own convention because of bad weather. The state convention raised the property taxes. The state convention raised the property requirements for voting, which means that a lot of former soldiers who fought for the country's freedom were excluded from voting because they weren't exactly in a position to pay for land because they weren't paid for their service while fighting in the Revolutionary War against Great Britain. So, in other words, in order to vote in the state legislature, you had to be a landowner because they didn't have any money to buy any land. They weren't able to vote in the state legislature or to vote at all. So this started to breed a lot of resentment and distrust within the state of Massachusetts, not only for the state government, but in the national government itself. So Massachusetts said, we want to pay back our war debt. We want to do it in a short amount of time, and we're going to do that by raising property taxes. Back in the day, if you couldn't pay your taxes, you went to what was called debtor's prison, or debtor's court, and you could be thrown in debtor's prison, and your property could be seized by the court. Well, all of this is ripe for corruption. And so the judges, lawyers, and merchants all involved in this process, they were the only ones making money from the property that was seized. Not only the land, but anything that was on the land when it was auctioned off to pay the loans for the land and all the property that was on it. So again, this is not making anyone happy, and the resentment and the distrust is growing and growing. So the merchants in the eastern cities made money by were making money. They were reestablishing all of the trade routes that were originally disrupted by the war and all the blockades that had been happening. And so you have the poor farmers in Massachusetts out west going bankrupt because they can't pay their loans and they never received their pay from being soldiers. But you have the wealthier merchants in the east who are living in the cities making money because they're now trading with foreign governments and foreign countries because they live near the ports. So you have this distinct divide of class and citizenship within one state. And that is just a breeding ground of discontent. So the farmers in the West are depressed and desperate, and they're put into court and eventually debtor's prison. But all the political leaders, because again, they have the wealth and the land, they're able to vote in the legislature and hold office, and they consider the farmers knaves and thieves, and who threatened the freedoms won in the war. So groups of farmers and former soldiers met in Conkey's Tavern and shared their frustration. And of course, they brought up the words that were so valiantly and beautifully said in the Declaration of Independence, and it became a rallying cry for them. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to institute a new government. But wait a minute, this government's new. Are they really talking about getting rid of the new again? Surely they're not. So calling themselves regulators, the farmers and the soldiers issued these demands: that paper money be printed, that no arrest be made for closing down courts, that courts no longer convene until an actual judicial system was reformed, and that the state constitution be amended to be more fair to all constituents, that fair taxes be established, and that voting rights be established that are not just based on land ownership. Seems pretty reasonable, right? Well, someone led the charge, and someone always steps up to lead the charge and things like this. And in this case, it was a guy named Daniel Shay. And Daniel Shay was a veteran of the American Revolution who had not been paid for his service. So he had a dog in this fight, so to speak. And as a regulator, he rallied and organized the rebels to a call to action, so to speak, in the fall of 1786. So they mobbed the courthouses in Northampton, Great Barrington, and Worcester, all, of course, in Massachusetts, to prevent any further judicial actions taking place against poor farmers who couldn't pay their debts. They stormed the courthouses in Northampton to prevent trials and imprisonment, and they stormed the courthouses in Springfield. So that went well. Then they decided to storm the courthouses in Springfield. But the governor decided to step in, and he sent the militia to stop them in Springfield. So so that's when the confrontation decided to go down. The governor said enough is enough. On January 25th, 1787, Captain Shays led 1,400 men towards Springfield in order to shut down the court. He also had the side mission of wanting to get enough weapons to head into Boston, which was the seat of Massachusetts at the time, to overthrow, and he was going to overthrow the Massachusetts government. Well, General Lincoln, who was in charge of the Massachusetts militia at the time, not the Lincoln you're thinking of from the Civil War. This is a different Lincoln. You're about 100 years too early, guys. Responded with about 4,400 men paid by wealthy merchants in Boston and met them coming from the east in Springfield. So this was a little bit of overkill. Look at the disparity in numbers, 4,400 to 1,400. Oh my word. So the wealthy merchants, again, disparity. Wealthy merchants paying for wealthy militia, almost mercenary types. Poor farmers who are rallying behind a cause. Wait a minute, didn't we just do this back in 1776 with Great Britain and the poor little patriots? Ringing a bell? Anyway, so here's the little hand-drawn map that Lincoln had in order to meet at Springfield and say, look, this is where you're going to meet. This is how you're going to head them off. Do it. So Shay took his men and he said, we're going to take a stand right here in front of the army. General Shepard and General Lincoln had his men fire warning shots above the regulators' head. The rebels didn't budge. Well, then the general said, okay, fire at waistband height. In other words, they fired directly into the rebels. Kill shots. 4 of the regulators died and 20 were wounded. Well, Shays' army and 2 other factions of rebels retreated and into small towns that they knew where they were going to find safe harbor, and they just collapsed. Meanwhile, General Lincoln decided to pursue them through a bitter snowstorm. Frostbitten and exhausted, they were still getting paid well. They tracked down the regulators. A lot of them did get away and escaped to the nearby states of New Hampshire and Vermont, where they were sheltered um, uh, because they had bounties on their head. However, by this time, General Washington was coming out of retirement. He was trying to be the voice of reason, and he was saying, this kind of thing is going to continue. His specific words were, General Washington thought not probable that the mischiefs will terminate. When this spirit first dawned, probably it might easily have checked, but it is scarcely within the reach of human men at this moment to say when or where or how it will end. In other words, more incidents like Shays' Rebellion are going to happen unless something changes. So George Washington comes out of retirement and attends the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia because it is very apparent that something has to change. So some regulators are hanged while others are pardoned. Daniel Shay himself lives in Vermont until he is pardoned 2 years after the rebellion. He then makes his way back to Massachusetts, where he lives in abject poverty. He finally does receive his pension at the age of 77, but doesn't quite get to enjoy his pension. He dies a year later. So in summary, Shays' militia was in fact stopped by the local militia. And remember, militias are controlled by the government. It did show that a nation needed a stronger central government. So that was one of the consequences of Shays' Rebellion. The other consequence was that it sparked fears that other rebellions would happen if something did not change. So it showed just how weak the Articles of Confederation were. But again, the Articles of Confederation were designed to be weak. The problem with it is that their weaknesses far outweighed their strengths. And the writers of the Articles of Confederation and our founding fathers never intended the Articles of Confederation to be so weak that it would cripple the nation as a whole. And it became very apparent that if the Articles of Confederation stood as they were, the nation was not going to survive. So another constitutional convention was called in 1787, and it is from there that we get the building blocks for the Constitution that we see today. So, quick review. True or false? The Articles of Confederation gave states the power to run the government. What'd you say? True. Very good. The 13 states made decisions based on a consensus. In other words, an agreement everybody necessarily is happy with, but could live with. That is also true. The states were forced to pay taxes to the national government. Were states forced to pay taxes? False. They were not forced to pay taxes. Hope you said false. All states had the same currency. Hope you said false. Good job. The Americans did not want to create a strong government because they feared it might become a tyrant. That is very true. Remember, we fought a war to get out from under a tyrant called King George III. Clicked that very fast, didn't I? False. Congress had no trouble paying its soldiers. That is false. Congress had a terrible time paying its soldiers. Why? Because they couldn't tax anybody. The states acted more like 13 separate countries, not one unified country. That is true. The Articles of Confederation were too difficult to fix, so the founders created the Constitution. That is actually true. And in the coming weeks, or in the coming week or so, we're going to explore that even further. I hope you got most of this down in your interactive notebook. If you have any questions, let me know.